All right, let's go to Roland Paris on this, former senior advisor on foreign policy to the Prime Minister, professor now of international affairs at the University of Ottawa. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
What's your take on the Prime Minister's remarks about being on the menu?
Well, I think he was telling the truth, which is that if the United States continues to effectively divide and conquer, especially among its closest allies that it's been targeting one after another, then they are each weaker in dealing with the United States individually. And that's Donald Trump's approach. He doesn't like multilateral gatherings because the relative weight of the United States is much greater when dealing one-on-one with other countries. So Mark Carney was pointing out, I think, the obvious, which is that there's much more negotiating leverage to be had by working together.
Okay, who do you see then as those middle powers, and who do you see already working together against a changing world order?
Well, he's in Europe, and there is an active discussion taking place right now in Europe about how to deal with the American threats towards Greenland. So I'm sure that is the context in which many of his remarks were taken. And he was essentially saying to those countries, you need to buck up because caving in is not a strategy. Whether this leads to an actual change in Canadian strategy and Canadian approaches remains to be seen, because in practice, Mark Carney has been very, very careful to try and avoid provoking Donald Trump or criticizing him directly.
Okay, so do you see signs of caving in from any of the European allies, from Canada? If so, what does that look like?
Well, I think what he was indirectly referring to was the fact that many countries, when Donald Trump came into office in his second term, were kind of racing to get to the Oval Office in the hopes of having some kind of special side deal with Trump. And he was able to negotiate very advantageous arrangements for the United States. Even the European Union as a whole, which is already a collection of countries, arguably a collection of middle powers, accepted a 15% tariff on European goods entering the United States as a way of just trying to get through what they thought was a moment of increased pressure and threats from the United States. But I think that one of the messages here from Mark Carney is that caving in invites further demands from Donald Trump. But again, what that actually means in practice and how willing Canada or any of these other countries will be to push back remains very unclear.
Okay, so Roland, what is your take on Trump's demand for Greenland for security reasons?
I think that it is outrageous. What we're seeing here is something from the 19th century. He's basically demanding ownership of Greenland. That is what he has placed as the most important thing for him. When he was being asked about this in interviews, he has said, really, it's the security, providing security in Greenland, even additional U.S. presence in Greenland, even a commitment from NATO to dramatically increase its presence in Greenland. Everything that's been offered to him is not good enough. Why? Because he thinks ownership is really important, because in his own words, it's psychologically important. He's asked, important for the United States or important for you? His answer is, it's important for me. This is an incredible, mad, individual wish to win over territory. And I see it within the context of him trying to show that he has accomplished more than the greatest presidents in the United States, including by expanding the territorial reach of the United States.
Should Ottawa then be legitimately concerned about a military push against Canada?
I think that the prospects of the United States using military force against Canada are so minuscule that they're close to zero. Nevertheless, there have been a lot of things that seemed impossible in the last few years that have suddenly become possible. It's jarring. Even just this episode with Greenland seems like it should be seen in a movie that would have been unbelievable just a few years ago. So I think, it is jarring to hear about the Canadian Defense Department, plotting out what Canada would do in the case of a U.S. military assault on Canada. To be clear, the job of military planners is to plan for the unthinkable. And I don't see this as an immediate or even medium-term or even long-term threat to Canada. The United States and Trump can get a lot from Canada by using economic pressure, and that's a threat in and of itself that we really need to pay attention to.
What would need to happen for NATO to be officially compromised? Would the U.S. have to move militarily on Greenland?
There's not going to be an official moment when NATO is compromised. You know, the whole idea of a defensive military alliance is a set of assumptions and trust. And it's trust that the members will come to each other's defense. And it's an assumption on the part of other countries that if they attack any NATO country, that they're going to face the combined strength of the alliance. So it's a set of ideas that gets reinforced over and over again. And when you have Donald Trump not just raising doubts about whether he would actually come to the defense of Poland, for example, if it were attacked, but actively using threats against another NATO country, then one of the things that does is it damages trust. Damage might even be a mild word here, and it really undermines the sense that NATO is united and would stand together in the face of external threats. Without that, it's very difficult to sustain a military alliance, even if it exists on paper.
Roland Paris, sir, got to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.